Well, fantastic to be here with two of my favourite people. So one I'm married to. That one's obviously not you, Mischa, so it's great to see you here.
We're kind of married to each other in a job,
we
volunteer
are kind of,
capacity.
It's very true. So just by way of introductions, I'm James, and we're here to talk about kind of non-profit, executive search, senior level hiring. So I've got my wife, my business partner, Donna Baker, with us today. So she's kind of our expert on this here at Keynote Group, and kind of good friend, board colleague, and fellow entrepreneur, Mischa Kaplan, who's with us as well. So... But you've changed jobs in the last year, Mischa. You kind of went to the dark side, didn't you? You went into the HR side of things. Is that right?
Yeah, kind of. So over the last, I guess for a bit more than a year now, I've been the director of HR and organizational development at Ottawa Tourism. So I have sort of that experience now to lean on, in addition to numerous sort of volunteer roles I've held on various nonprofit boards over the years.
Yeah, so you're officially my vice chair, I believe, of the Board of Trade. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's right. Yeah.
So both of you are my bosses, essentially, is what I'm kind of reading into this. Is that kind of how it works? And Donna, obviously, you lead all of our C-level searches at Keynote. So, I mean, you've done a fair number of kind of senior non-profit searches recently.
Yeah, quite a variety, whether it's executive director, C-suite, CFO, COO, a couple of VP roles. Yeah, varying areas in the MPO world as well.
So Mischa's not the enemy to you, obviously, then if he's a board person doing this. But so, as always, I just want to have a bit of a conversation with you both about some of your experiences, both hiring at a senior level within organizations, some of the processes you may have been through yourself as well.
Okay.
And I want to really focus on where things have gone wrong. So I know not always great to focus on the negative, but if people can take away a few kind of lessons or at least, be aware of that. So, when we get brought in, Donna, and I'll kind of start with you on this, the board comes to us, typically the chair of the board will come to us and say, look, we've got this significant opportunity, we're looking to bring somebody in.
Yeah.
How do they even get started from your perspective, even kind of engaging with us? Are there things they should be doing before they come to us, things that somebody like Mischa can share some of his experiences on?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly when organizations come to us, a couple of key things that we would love to see ahead of time is just... an idea on what the role is, I would say, to start with. We're happy to work with a board and define a full job description, but understanding what those kind of parameters are. And more importantly, I would say who is going to be involved in the search process. So you have your board of directors, which can be quite large sometimes.
You're talking about the Ottawa Board of Trade now. So a good sized board there.
Yeah. And it doesn't always set an organization up for success to have every single person involved in the selection process. So what we always ask a board to do is identify a selection committee. So who kind of within the board has the expertise to be involved in the search process. So is there anybody that has an HR or recruitment background? Who has the time? I mean, boards are often voluntary, so not everyone has the time to invest in the recruitment process. And then anyone that's going to be a key decision maker. So typically chair or vice chair is a key decision maker within a board. So kind of just thinking about who's going to be involved in that process, who's going to have the time, and then what that will look like for those individuals that commit. Because once they have committed, there is a time component involved.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, from your side then, how do you even start thinking about from a board, if you've got 12, 14, 16 people, sometimes more on the board, how do you even start deciding who should be on that selection committee?
It's a good question. I think it's interesting too because Donna's point kind of makes me think experiences I've had in the past. Usually boards will get one of those things right or two of those things right, but often completely screw up the third one. And you really do need all three of those elements to achieve success, I think. So I would certainly echo that idea of alignment of sort of having a very narrow focus for who's actually going to be involved with this process. And I've seen sometimes these things don't sort of occur naturally to boards. So I've seen situations in the past where volunteer boards have not had key decision makers involved in that process, which always kind of strikes me as a bit weird because that would be you'd think sort of just if you had no experience in this situation at all, that would be one of the first things that would come to you.
Exactly.
But I've seen situations where that pretty much every case I've ever seen it leads to some kind of problems where they get the first two components right, but then the key leaders on that board are not actually involved in who's choosing going to lead the organization, and it just I don't think I have to go into detail about why that's going to be problematic, but it always is without fail.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because then you're making a decision. Okay, these are the people we're going to trust on the board to make this decision. But I mean, I would assume you'd still always want to bring that selection committee and basically they advise the rest of the board. We believe, based on a fair and equitable process, that this is the person we're going to recommend to be hired as CEO. So it still goes back to a full board vote. Would that be your approach on this?
I guess it depends on the nature of the board and depends on the nature of position. It's going to be, there's several variables I would say that would sort of dictate that. But as a general practice, I would say that's probably, I've chaired a couple boards in the past, and I would say I would not be comfortable moving on, making a decision like that without the full support of the board.
Yeah, and that's typically what we see. When we get through that kind of recruitment process, there's one candidate that's identified by the selection committee, and then they make that recommendation to the full board. Of, we've been through and walked through the steps that they've been through, so the full board are comfortable that there's been a process and due diligence, performed to get to this one individual that you're recommending.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, come back to the point you made about the time element. I mean, think about it. How much time do you give a week right now to volunteer boards? I mean, if you were to take an average day, is it
imagine.
2 hours a week? Are we talking 20 hours a week, Mischa? I mean, you're a very committed community leader.
I'd say probably at least minimum 5, sometimes up to 15, depending on sort of how things go, and sometimes even more than that.
Yeah, and that's before there's even something like this going on. So then this is the thing. So one of the things we always find is, I'm a big believer that time kills deals. So the longer a research process goes on, you're going to get lack of engagement. People are going to start dropping through the cracks. So you've got to keep a pace and momentum about it. I know it's something that you're a bit of a control freak, Donna, so I don't mind saying that here for everyone in the world to hear. But how do you keep a volunteer group of people who are giving up their own time, sacrificing time with families for something as critical as this to get done, but keep the momentum and pace? I mean, what are some of the things you do? And I'd love to hear from you, Mischa, as well, kind of what some of your advice might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think right at the start of the search process, we're always very clear in terms of what the expectation is from a time perspective. So if there is somebody in the selection committee that feels they can't commit to that, they can select out very early on. So we'll say, it involves 1 or 2 hours commitment up front to do a stakeholder consultation where we actually, sit down and interview you and determine what you think is required from the role.
And that's with each stakeholder?
That's with each stakeholder, so each member of the selection committee. We then may do one follow-up meeting with everyone together just to make sure that we cover any areas where everyone's aligned, which is great, and then cover all of the areas where people disagree, which always happens, and just get everybody on the same page so we can move forwards with a clear idea of what the full selection committee is comfortable with. And then really there isn't any involvement until the interview process. But the interview, I mean, if you select, say, 4 or 5 candidates that you want to interview, an hour and a half per interview with gaps in between, you're looking at a full day's commitment.
Just for the first round? Just
for the first round of interviews, yep. Then there would be a second round, then there would be follow-up decisions. So I think it's kind of setting that clear expectation early on, but also having somebody that within that selection committee can make a decision. So if we go through the process and 2 or 3 people are not available or can't commit to something, is there one person that can say, I will make the decision for the full selection committee? That's always really beneficial for organizations, really, more so than ourselves, so that you can say, okay, I'm comfortable with Mischa deciding. If I'm not available, I'm comfortable with whatever Mischa decides. And I would recommend that right at the beginning as well for the selection committee.
What do you think, Mischa?
I think that's a good point as well, that on top of some of the things that Donna went over about how you form a selection committee, that level of trust, I think it works a lot better when you have people that have worked together before on anything similar, or have just the level of trust in their own professionalism that they can be able to give those kind of responsibilities to other people. I think from a board perspective, one of the key things that, I mean, I would echo everything Donna just said, but one of the key things you can recognize as a board member when you're going through a process like this is that it's probably going to be the most important thing you do as a board member. Regardless of everything else you do, making a decision around leadership is going to be the most important element of that. And I think that's sometimes can again be forgotten, with certain boards that it's such a key piece of governance. So I think that's the key thing, is to say, if you're going to make one single push in your 1 year or 2 year term as a director or a chair or anything like that, that's going to be the legacy you leave on the board, is what the actual management of the organization looks like.
I appreciate that. So let's talk about the actual search itself. I mean, quite often, confidentiality is key. So unfortunately, we know that the average kind of tenure of a C-suite individual in any organization is 5 to 7 years. Typically, that's a really good window. And in that time, they're going to accomplish an awful lot. It gets to a point where the organization's ready for a new phase change and everything that comes with it. Sometimes that's a decision that's made by the board before it's made by the individuals in the job. So there are some sensitivities around this. And that's difficult because you've got a commitment and loyalty to people as you're going through the process. So I'd love to hear from you, confidentiality, non-disclosure, how you can kind of put a lock around things, some of the steps or some of the advice you'd give to a board that perhaps hasn't been through this type of change before.
I think that point just reinforces the need to have a small selection committee that's managing this, and that it's been given the level of autonomy that they can go ahead with something that they don't need to be sort of reporting every single step of the way to a board that could be 12 or more individuals. I think you add an additional level of risk around the confidentiality with every single extra person you bring into the process. So if you can keep it to if you're working with a search firm, if you keep it to the search firm and then sort of 3 or 4 key members as a selection committee, that will help. And especially if those are people that you've done your due diligence around ensuring they're people who've gone through the process before, people who understand the importance of the confidentiality aspect of it. That just, it just reinforces that need to have that selection committee, be given autonomy and kind of move forward.
So about from the candidate side though, Donna, because we know when we're doing a search, our initial outreach could be to literally hundreds of people, and we're always, there's discretion that's got to be in there. And you're basically saying, I've got this incredible opportunity you should consider, but I can't tell you where it is. So how do you manage that candidate part? When do you start disclosing who it is, what they're trying to accomplish? Maybe talk us through that.
Yeah, I think fortunately, when we're dealing with a C-suite level search, candidates are fairly familiar with the recruitment process being confidential up until to a certain point. And I think it's just making them aware very early on that the reasons behind the confidentiality. So whether it's because somebody's still in the role, whether it's because it's funding, whatever the reason may be, just make them aware. But give them an overview of who the organization is, where they sit within the world of kind of, the nonprofit world, what the role will look like. And then typically when they come in to meet with me in person, so they've been through normally 2 or 3 rounds of screening already at that point. So we've really ascertained that they are interested and that they are, genuinely committed to continuing on in the process. We'll have them sign an NDA at that point when they come in to meet with me. And then there's kind of full disclosure at that point as to who the organization is and if they want to continue kind of in the process. Most people do. I don't think you get that far into a recruitment process and walk away. But there is always that time, when candidates are like, well, no, not interested in that type of role or that type of organization. So,
But that's the risk comes into play at that stage. I mean, if you've got, say, 5 people, yes, an NDA is helpful, but we know for well pillow talk, they're going to tell a significant other it doesn't take much for slip of a tongue for that to start getting out. And, then you're left with a really tricky situation, whether it's as a senior leader in an organization, is going through this, supporting that, or as a board member, where suddenly publicly there's knowledge out there that the change is happening. So, any advice for somebody or any experiences other than just offer apologies and just keep moving forward?
I do think if you're in a situation like Donna described, where you have where that risk is heightened because of, if you have someone in the position, those kind of things, then you may want to sort of go above and beyond what you would normally do in that case, where you're just sort of highlighting confidentiality at every point, maybe even asking for, if you're a board that doesn't have a confidentiality agreement that comes with serving on the board, maybe introducing something like that, or especially to whether it's at the executive level or anywhere there's sort of a huge degree of sensitivity. And again, if you're in a situation where risk is higher, to sort of walk through those risk factors and see what they look like, and think proactively, how are you going to manage them if they do come up? If this does get out, what is your plan A? What is your plan B? What is the most likely scenario? So I think some of those sort of basic risk planning things are really important to do from a board perspective if you're in a situation like that where you've got this additional level of risk that comes from somewhere else.
Nice. So let me change gears slightly on us if we can. So we've seen some wonderful kind of progress with regard to diversity on boards, diversity in leadership, but we know we're not at the end of that journey. We're working with a credible organization locally. It's an organization Donna's helping, which is empowering women in leadership roles and driving investment into women-led organizations. But managing diversity, ensuring there's no bias in a search is also delicate. 'Cause you're also trying to find the right person. So there's always this conundrum of like, how do we ensure a diverse talent pool? So I'm glad I don't have to answer this one because it's one of those tricky ones of, how do you ensure that you have an unbiased but diverse, fair hiring process so that you can make the right choice for your organization while considering candidates from every single cohort out there. So I don't know who wants to take that one first. So I'm going to kind of throw it across the table at you both. I'm going to sit back and basically let you fend that
And
one
let
off.
us find out.
I guess I'll sort of offer something from an HR perspective, which is that it seems like the research around eliminating bias is really sort of on the fence right now around how possible it is to eliminate bias from a process. Whether or not things like when you hear, ideas like, they'd be a good cultural fit, like not from a sort of, ethno-cultural perspective, but they'd be a good cultural fit with the organization. Yeah. Often that's kind of a bit of a mask for saying, well, they would be a good sort of, cultural fit in the more problematic senses.
Yes.
So I think there's still a lot of as far as sort of the scholarship and the research around diversity hiring, we still have a lot to learn in that area. I agree. I would absolutely agree that I think there's no question that introducing some level of mechanism you can use to eliminate more bias, there's no question that that's going to be helpful in the process. It's just a question of sort of what elements to eliminate and how you go about doing them. I mean, there's obviously tons of sort of AI platforms now you can use. That seems to be one of the sort of sexy things right now with HR tech and HR analytics is introducing sort of some systems that can eliminate those things for you. But again, that's sort of looking at the areas of bias that you want to eliminate. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. We're doing some work right now with auto tourism where we're working not just for sort of senior level hires, but hires at every step of the organization. Of how everyone involved in the hiring process can be sort of just more aware of their own internal biases. It comes down to
learning and kind of development for your own team before you even go out to market to hire.
Exactly, and I think just sort of being conscious of some of those basic concepts, like the wording you use in a job description. There's been lots of research that have shown if you use certain types of wording, it's more likely to attract male candidates versus other types of wording that's going to attract female candidates. So I think, even just sort of being aware of some of those I guess, kind of low-hanging fruit, things that are pretty easy to implement for a board or an organization that will have, hopefully, a positive effect on how much you can eliminate bias.
Interesting. Nice. Donna, what would you add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, from a bias perspective, it's something that we work with anyone that joins our organization. We do a tremendous amount of coaching around that because obviously we're interviewing a high volume of individuals every single week. So we want people to eliminate as many of their personal biases towards those individuals and really kind of step back and say that, this is the predetermined criteria. This is what I'm looking for. Is this individual a good fit for the role from a cultural perspective, like you were talking about, but also from a skills perspective? And we really focus a lot on parking any kind of bias. And then for a selection committee, what we try and do from a diversity standpoint is really present a diverse portfolio or selection of candidates to review right at the beginning of the process. And that could be, that's from stretching the boundaries in terms of what you've put down as qualified criteria. So it might be, you said 5 years. Well, we have someone with 4 and they're tremendous. And it's stretching every single part of the criteria, whether not just focused on gender, it's experience, it's everything. And we'll present a fairly fluid list, and then we'll narrow it down to the ones that go back to what we agreed on right at the beginning of the selection process. This is what's required from the role. So who is best to fit exactly what was required from the initial kind of selection.
And I like the way,
I want to add to that. I think that there's, as far as the coaching goes, I think a big part of that is coaching people on why they're identifying certain characteristics. So, you have this idea that the typical person thinks of a leader as someone who's, fits these various characteristics. And, for the longest period, that was primarily male, primarily white, all these things that were sort of, very extroverted. Yeah. And all these things have been shown again and again, not necessarily to transfer into actual good leadership.
Yeah.
So I think being conscious of the fact that if you come to the table with an unconscious bias around what a leader should look like or what those characteristics need to be, it helps to have someone around the table pointing you in a different direction, playing the devil's advocate, saying, why are we identifying, the sort of that type of individual. Not to say that someone's going to come to the table and say, I want a tall white man, but to say that, if someone says, well, they need to be someone who's a decisive decision maker who can make a decision on the spot, that's not necessarily going to be conducive to good leadership all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think helping the decision makers understand why they're identifying that as a it might be a key requirement for the position, but not always.
Yeah.
And it's eliminating that groupthink as well. I mean, one of the shifts we made as an organization is moving away from group stakeholders where we're talking to multiple people at the same time, because unfortunately organizations together, they can follow the kind of leadership of one person around a table. So you'll find that with boards, they can be driven by one conversation or one perspective. Whereas when you isolate people and get their individual opinions and perspectives, it's also an opportunity to talk to them and say, well, I don't necessarily, you need to maybe challenge your thinking on this, because you can actually work with them individually to coach. But it's the same with feedback. And when we ask people to give us feedback on candidates, is get the feedback individually. Because if I gave you my feedback and we're around the table with 8 other people, not everyone's going to share their opinions. They might be embarrassed because they thought something different about somebody. So we remove those opportunities for barriers to say, you tell me individually what you think. Because now we'll be the ones that will bring the consensus back and say, here's all the key things we heard. These were outliers, so we can debate the most need, but here's the key characteristics. Because we all judge people in different ways and evaluate people in different ways based on our own experiences. And those experiences are often very, very valuable. And if you have the right selection committee that's been put together that brings different experiences, backgrounds, understandings, by the time everyone's had a chance to evaluate a candidate, you have a really balanced perspective. And I think, again, it's just good process, good governance, and a good setup at the front end. So, okay, so a little bit easier for you now. So let's change gears a little easier. So I know it's a little early to be kind of challenging you on ideas like that. But we've got probably the tightest labor market we've ever seen in Ottawa. I will tell you, for the executive search industry, it's a wonderful time to be in our industry because it's incredibly hard to find people. Ottawa, though, is, Toronto's growing well, Ottawa's doing well, we know Vancouver's doing well, but, there's other areas of Canada that aren't flying as quickly. We've seen a lot of candidates from out of town express interest in coming here. So when it comes to hiring, for a senior leadership role, and you're looking at candidates from, typically locally, if you're doing your advertising, there is an opportunity right now to go national, but also internationally to draw talent up from the US. There's an individual in the US that's causing people to question whether they should be living there anymore. So, maybe give us some of your thoughts, some of your opinions, some of your experiences bringing talent in from outside of a city as well for kind of more senior leadership opportunities. I'll start with you, Donna, on this one.
Sure. Again, it kind of comes back to that initial discussion. I think the comfort of the organisation that we're working with, there are risk factors when you go outside of a city, and we've seen it. I've seen offers get turned down, even though we've had multiple discussions about relocation. So I think it's getting that comfort level from the selection committee at the beginning of the process. Do they even want to look outside of the city? Do we feel that there is the talent pool here? And even if they, if organizations say we want to start locally, we will still kind of broaden the scope. And I think it's identifying people, if we talk nationally, for example, that have a reason to move. So not just there's a great opportunity. Do you want to come live in Ottawa? It's a great city to live in, because it is a great city to live in. We came for 2 years. We've been here for 13. So, but are there any other factors that would bring them back to the city? Did they grow up here? Did they move away? Were they educated here? Do they have any ties to the city? Are there any other factors beyond just work that would make them want to move here? They're kind of things that we look at when we're looking at relocation from a candidate's perspective. And then from an organization's perspective, it's what are they willing to do to relocate somebody? Because there's a financial implication involved. There's a family implication often involved as well. So are they prepared to offer relocation packages? Are they prepared to? We always encourage organizations to have the extended family involved in the process somehow. So if you're flying somebody here for an interview, and they have a wife or a husband, if they have children, do you bring those individuals to the city as well so they can experience what it's like to live here? It's getting kind of buy-in past the one individual that you're considering.
That's an important one, because it is a family decision. I mean,
it is.
For you, you're at tourism, so you spend your entire day as part of an organisation that's advocating for the merits of being in Ottawa. So maybe you can speak to it from both on Donna's point of how to consider it from a board perspective, but also why this is a great city to pull people into and how you might pitch that.
Yeah, I think certainly the money thing is a big, the money thing you bring up is a big understanding that there's going to be an additional financial impact to a global search and probably even a national search.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that makes Ottawa pretty special, Ottawa is where the bulk of my experience is, so that's the market I can speak to the best. But Ottawa has a great ecosystem for that kind of thing. There's a number of different organizations here that work around the areas of talent attraction, things like that. I would say there's a fairly sort of good spirit amongst recruitment firms here that are fairly willing to work with each other. So I think you have a number of sort of positive factors that if you are a board and you're looking for additional assistance in sort of what's it going to mean recruiting nationally or globally, pulling into some of those sort of leveraging that ecosystem we have here in Ottawa. And I know that does exist in a number of other large Canadian cities as well. So that's certainly something that I think is wise for any board to do.
No, I think that we can all agree that Ottawa is quite simply the greatest city to live in the world.
Yeah.
Other than maybe a mountainside villa in Whistler. But okay, we'll leave that one for another day. So, assuming we've now found an individual, we've now been successful, the board's worked collaboratively, they've kept pace. There's two kind of things we need to look at now. One, there may be somebody in the role and you've got to act with dignity and respect to transition them. So I'd love to touch on that in a second. And also then to what to do to help the new candidate be successful. So maybe we start with the less desirable of those two tasks, which is working with them. How do you manage that when you are exiting an employee, when there is going to be a change at leadership level? This is somebody most likely who's given incredible service to your organization and, taken the organization to places you haven't been before, but you've got a sensitive situation. I mean, maybe Donna, from our side, maybe talk about the advice you'd give to an organization, then Mischa, I'd maybe look to you from both an HR and from a board perspective on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it is always difficult. No one enjoys exiting anybody from an organization. But I think we always encourage whoever's going to be involved in that process just to kind of focus on the reasons why. Like why they've made that decision, why they decided that there was a need for new leadership in the first place, because then it's easier to rationalize, I guess, the decision. It's easier to find comfort in it. But also when speaking to the person that's leaving, I think it's important to, as James said, talk about the successes that they've had. If somebody's been with you for 5 or 7 years, they've typically achieved a lot in that time period. So talk about what they have achieved, why this change is being made. Again, if somebody is being exited from an organization, it's much easier for them to understand the process if they know the whys behind it, if they can kind of, see, okay, I get, where they're heading isn't really what I can bring to the table. And just being honest, being very direct. And then again, kind of circling back on that kind of confidentiality piece, because you're exiting one individual, but there's still typically a whole organization to manage outside of that kind of one individual. And really as a board, you want to be delivering that message to the internal team and any external stakeholders as well. So it's just kind of doing the best to manage that kind of confidentiality piece as well.
Mischa?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the other piece I would offer as well is that in a lot of nonprofit cases there's limited resources as far as money goes. Often that leads to an organization being more reluctant to sort of get legal counsel around these things or to go with a minimum amount of legal counsel. But I think that certainly in Ontario and most provinces in Canada, employment law has become so complex that you need to have really good legal counsel. And so I think, if you're on a board and you're looking for a situation like this, you need to reach out to your network to figure out who do I go to for legal counsel, and make sure it's someone who specializes in employment law, who can not just give you advice around sort of how to protect the organization, but can give you that sort of additional level of HR kind of advice to say, here's the legal advice, but here's another layer of it that will help you sort of speak to some of those things you were talking about. Respect, confidentiality, things like that. Because there is the legal angle, and the legal angle is complex, but there's also the sort of people angle as well. And I think no matter how much sort of expertise you have around that selection committee or the executive committee, whoever is making that decision, you do need an outside voice that can kind of give you some counsel in that area. And I find, and if you're dealing with a good employment lawyer, then they'll be able to provide that.
So do you think it helps then to have somebody with legal expertise on a board? Would you say?
I feel like that's it's a good question. I think absolutely yes. I would say certainly that yes, it helps to have people with legal advice. And I know I've been on sort of several boards where we've had, a couple lawyers around the table, and it always is helpful.
A little harder to take minutes though, because they'll challenge it right down. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Having said that, I think I think it can kind of be, you can run the risk of sort of assuming that that a corporate lawyer or an M&A lawyer will have the answer to everything. And I think that's something that happens in sort of smaller boards, again, with limited resources. We can think, well, sure,
A lawyer's a lawyer,
Donna's a lawyer, so she's going to give me all the advice I need, even though Donna practices family law or something like that. So I think it helps because lawyers have a very sort of specific type of training and can sort of understand, contracts and things like that very well. But again, if you don't have someone with specific employment law expertise around the table, I think it really helps to go outside of the organization.
So we're talking about good counsel. We're talking about being candid, being direct, being truthful with somebody, but never forgetting these are people that we're dealing with. And so it's ensuring that we treat people with the respect that we would want in the reverse situation, and we recognize their service and what they've done for the organization prior to that. So let's then flip it to the person who's taken the job and what we do to help their success, because again, they've come in new, they've clearly got some great expertise, they've been through a great process, but it's a new job for them. So how do you support their success to take them from, day zero right through to the point where they had 5 years of kind of success? What are those first steps that you'd recommend? And maybe Mischa, I'll start with you when you're working with a new leader. Yeah,
I think it goes back to the points that Donna made originally about doing, getting a proper job description in place, doing a job analysis to figure out what exactly you're looking for. If you have those foundational pieces, it's going to set you up hopefully for success when you have someone new in the position. And other elements to it being realistic, setting up hopefully a really good working relationship with that individual and the board leadership. Ensuring, of course, that you're bringing someone in that is going to have some kind of vision for the organization. I mean, all those things will help hugely in setting the person up for success. But I think sort of understanding from a board perspective, understanding, and again, this is often happens in the nonprofit world where you see boards or board members sometimes that have difficulty differentiating between the role of the board and the role of management. So I think giving the person that freedom, you set them up for success by giving them a good job description, giving them sort of their, the lanes that they're going to stay in. But then you let them do their thing for the most part. And I think understanding that the board governs and the management leads is really the key to understanding that and allowing that person to have the flexibility to sort of do what they're going to do.
So you should put that on a T-shirt. That's good. Board governance person leads. I like that. So Donna, when we get to that?
That would help me. What would I add to that? I think there's quite often a lengthy time period between an offer being accepted and someone starting in a role, especially at a senior level. So I think anything that can be done between that time period to build a relationship, whether it's introducing the new incumbent to board members that maybe weren't involved in the selection process, and it's not necessarily formalized. It can be in a coffee or something like that. Getting them to reach out to key stakeholders that they are going to be interacting with once they are hired, kind of building some of those connections before someone comes in. And then once someone's started, something that we advocate a lot for is that kind of post-placement coaching support. So actually bringing in an external coach, and it's something that we offer as part of our search process, so that someone does have that support and guidance external to the organization, external to us, that can support and guide them through that kind of learning curve, because it is a steep learning curve whenever you join any organization in any new role. And if you can have somebody coaching you through some of those hurdles that you will see, it makes it easier for the new individual coming into the organization to overcome them.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point. I mean, every elite athlete that I've ever had the privilege of meeting works with coaches to get 0.5%
Even
improvement.
I have a coach, and I'm not an elite athlete.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're a better athlete than I am. So, but it's huge when you've got, even when we've been building Keynote, I know how lonely it can get sometimes with some of the decisions. Every decision you make has implications. Some of them aren't popular. Having somebody to talk to who's outside your immediate circle with complete discretion is key. So I know it's been a game changer for some of the people that you've worked with, having that coach and providing that support. So again, it's tough in a nonprofit environment in particular because resources can be thin. but I would argue that that investment is going to maximize the chance of success for the person. So it's a balance, financial against opportunity for the organization as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I agree with that completely. I think it's almost something these days that you need to kind of bake into the price a little bit when you're actually doing the financial analysis. If can we hire a person? You want to maybe factor in that additional cost, whether it's sort of traditional sort of executive coaching or if it's another form of professional development that the person has identified works for them. I think those are things that I've seen make or break a successful process before. Is having that the board giving that allowance to say. Yes, we recognize the value of that, and we recognize that there's going to be, not just incremental improvements that come from it, but massive improvements as well.
Yeah.
So I think, understanding that needs to be something factored into the price that you're going to pay for someone in that position.
100%. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's it for today. So again, I want to thank you, Donna Baker, Managing Partner at Keynote Group, and Mischa Kaplan, Vice Chair of the Board of Trade and also Head of HR for Tourism Ottawa as well. So thank you for joining us today. This has been great. I'm James. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.